Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. In our series of Pilgrim Psalms, I want to read from Psalm 7. Lord my God, I take refuge in you. Save and deliver me from all who pursue me, or they will tear me apart like a lion and rip me to pieces with no one to rescue me. Lord my God, if I have done this and there is guilt on my hands, if I have repaid my ally with evil or without cause have robbed my foe, then let my enemy pursue and overtake me. Let him trample my life to the ground and make me sleep in the dust. Arise, Lord, in your anger. Rise up against the rage of my enemies. Awake, my God, decree justice. Let the assembled peoples gather around you, while you sit enthroned over them on high. Let the Lord judge the peoples. Vindicate me, Lord, according to my righteousness, according to my integrity, O Most High. Bring to an end the violence of the wicked and make the righteous secure. You, the righteous God who probes minds and hearts. My shield is God Most High, who saves the upright in heart. God is a righteous judge, a God who displays his wrath every day. If he does not relent, he will sharpen his sword, he will bend and string his bow. He has prepared his deadly weapons, he makes ready his flaming arrows. Whoever is pregnant with evil conceives trouble and gives birth to disillusionment. Whoever digs a hole and scoops it out falls into the pit they have made. The trouble they cause recoils on them. Their violence comes down on their own heads. I will give thanks to the Lord because of his righteousness. I will sing the praises of the name of the Lord Most High. Well, Psalm 7 is technically speaking, it's not one of the Pilgrim Psalms. But it relates to an issue that all pilgrims will inevitably have to deal with, namely the issue of opposition, and how we as pilgrims should respond to it. It's the longest of the Psalms in the collection of Psalms so far, but it has a number of connections with the 6 Psalms that precede it. The first 2 Psalms express complementary perspectives about God and his world. Psalm 1 contrasts the righteous and the wicked and their vastly different destinies. And Psalm 2 contrasts the misplaced arrogance of the nations in their opposition to God and God's power and authority over them. Psalm 7 is an example of how these perspectives work out in the psalmist's own experience. It also begins with a title that suggests a connection with real events in David's life, and the content of Psalm 3 to Psalm 6 all make that same connection. They're all heartfelt pleas for deliverance or relief from a situation that David was facing. In the case of Psalm 7, it seems he was being falsely accused, and the Psalm's title suggests that Cush the Benjamite is the one who is falsely accusing him of wrongdoing. We know absolutely nothing about this person, although it's often been noted that whilst he was probably a real person, someone that is in mind when David names him, it may be that he represents a group of people. And the fact that Cush is from the tribe of Benjamin is significant in terms of the conflict between him and David, because David has a history of conflict and opposition from this tribe. When the Philistines killed Saul, who was also from the tribe of Benjamin, it was David who took his place as the king of Israel. And it seems that some, if not all perhaps, in the tribe of Benjamin were unhappy about this state of affairs. It's likely that since God had chosen someone from their tribe to be Israel's first king, that they assumed that their tribe was especially chosen by God to lead the nation. And it's possible even that some of the elite amongst them might have felt particularly aggrieved, seeing themselves as prime candidates for the top job. And if that was the case, and given human nature it seems quite likely, David would have been seen as a false king, a pretender to the throne. To paraphrase the Jedi Master Yoda, misplaced and unresolved anger leads to the dark side. And so the opposition of the tribe of Benjamin and their enmity towards David did not fade with the passing of time. Quite the opposite, in fact. It seems to have deepened. Years after his coronation, David had to flee for his life and escape from Jerusalem when his son Absalom enacted a revolt against him. And as he fled the city, a Benjamite called Shimei cursed him. He accused David of being a man of blood and a scoundrel, and called out, "The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned," clearly blaming David for the demise of the house of Saul, and suggesting that, again, as I say, that David was a pretender to the throne, that place belonged to Saul's family, Saul's tribe. Still later, when David had returned to Jerusalem after Absalom's death and the defeat of his armies, another Benjamite named Sheba led another revolt against him. So it's safe to say that David would not have counted the tribe of Benjamin amongst his most devoted subjects. In fact, when Cush comes after him, it is with venomous fury. Notice that in the first two verses, David feels like he's being pursued so fiercely that he describes his enemy as being like a ravaging lion ready to tear him apart. Eugene Peterson captures the sense of the Hebrew well in his translation. "God, I am running to you for dear life. The chase is wild. If they catch me, I'm finished. Ripped to shreds by foes fierce as lions." However, it's the first verse also that sets the stage for the rest of the psalm, for it reveals the foundation upon which David is standing. He begins by affirming, "Lord my God, I take refuge in you." And we shouldn't think that this is David running to help just because he's now in a bit of a difficult situation, a tight spot, because the verb take is in the past tense. David knows from previous past personal experience that God is a refuge. In fact, he says so in Psalm 2, "Blessed are all who take refuge in the Lord." In the First Testament, blessing is associated with an Eden-like existence that includes a harmonious relationship with God and humanity, as well as material well-being. God is and has been David's refuge in the past, and he will be God will be his refuge now in this situation. David doesn't actually spell out the specifics of the accusation that's been made against him. But from verses 3 to 4, it seems that he's been accused of doing evil to someone who was an ally, someone he had no need to regard as an enemy, of robbing someone who was an enemy but whom he had no cause to abuse because this person had not taken any action against David that warranted retaliation. And David is particularly aggrieved at the accusation because he knows that it is false. He's so certain of his innocence that he employs what's known as a self-curse formula, inviting God to judge him and to grant his enemy victory over him if God finds him to be guilty. It is, of course, a risky strategy. The divine judge is not like an earthly judge who has to make a judgment based on the evidence that's presented to them in court. However, as we all know all too well nowadays, those responsible for upholding the law can be corrupt. They can present false evidence in court. But as David acknowledges in verse 9, the divine judge to whom he appeals searches hearts and minds. In other words, he can't be fooled. As the writer to the Hebrews puts it, nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. You know, and of course we often think, we fool ourselves into thinking that we are innocent when perhaps we're guilty. And by calling on God to judge him, David is really risking being wrong here in some way. And it's instructive that in Revelation 2 and 3, Jesus gives John messages for the churches, and those messages all begin with the words, "I know." And the messages show exactly that he knows exactly what is going on in those churches. When we calling God to judge him to examine the case, David is really putting himself at risk, but he trusts in God's judgment. And he also really believes that he's innocent. And by protesting his innocence, David isn't actually claiming to have moral perfection. He's not suggesting that he has never sinned or done anything wrong. He's merely saying that he is innocent of this particular accusation. And for David, it wasn't actually just a personal matter. In ancient times, the king was the final legal authority responsible for upholding justice in the land. And to have his integrity attacked undermined the whole judicial process. I mean, when a person who's in authority is accused of wrongdoing, it's often the case then that the integrity of the organisation that they're a part of is called into question. Whilst David was clearly personally hurt by these false accusations, there's a lot more at stake here than David's feelings. And it's very difficult to know. I know from personal experience, it's really difficult to know how to respond to false accusations when someone's got completely the wrong end of the stick. What do? It's easy in your defence to sound like someone who's just really justifying themselves, justifying their actions. And the reality is that people believe what they want to believe, despite evidence to the contrary. And sadly, many people are all too willing to believe the worst about us, and are often unwilling to give the benefit of the doubt. So what can we do if we find ourselves falsely accused? Well, David responds by doing something that his enemies might not have expected. Because David was a highly skilled warrior, and his enemies might have assumed that he would engage in violence against his accuser. But instead, he does what I think is the only thing you really can do when you've been falsely accused. He takes refuge in God. He calls on him to arise in his anger in David's defence. Instead of assuming the role as judge, which as king was his right, he trusts himself to the perfect justice and judgment of God. As we reflect on his response, we're reminded, of course, of Jesus, who is our perfect example. As the Apostle Peter writes, "To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly." When he calls on God to arise, he's not suggesting that God's fallen asleep in a job. In Psalm 121, we're told that God never slumbers or sleeps, but continually watches over his people. Rather, this call for God is a call for God to rouse himself, to stir himself up and act against the injustice that God sees. Some readers might be troubled by David's request for God to arise in his anger against the rage of David's enemies. But David knows that God is the righteous judge who, because of his holiness, cannot be less than angry at injustice. And we shouldn't think that calling on God for justice, David is looking for some sort of special treatment here. Whilst he's obviously aggrieved that he's been falsely accused, he's also aware that the injustice he's experiencing is part and parcel of life. It's what it is to live in a sinful, broken world. Injustice is everywhere. And so he calls for God to provide justice among the people, that is to say, among the nations. He knows that God is a just God, and that God hates injustice wherever it is to be found. So he's not looking for special favour, but rather the justice he desires for himself is the same justice he desires to see among the nations, as one who is upright in heart, who loves God and seeks to obey his commands. David cannot help but be aggrieved at injustice in the world. And the Christian church, of course, has a long history of speaking and working against injustice in the world, not because it's the trendy thing to do, but because it reflects the heart of God. David is so certain of his innocence that he knows that if God rises up against injustice, then he will be vindicated in this matter. And it's with that in mind that he pictures God as a righteous warrior who will protect him and dispense justice against the wicked. Just as a shield deflects the blows of an enemy, so God will use his shield to deflect the attacks of those who have assailed David. He is sharpening his sword and getting his arrows ready to do battle for the upright in heart, for the innocent, for David. And for modern readers and followers of Jesus, this can all be a bit troubling. I mean, on the face of it, David's claim of innocence and being upright in heart seems contrary with Romans 3:23, where Paul says that all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. Excuse me. But as noted, he's only claiming innocence in this particular case. He's not suggesting that he has never done anything wrong. That said, for 21st century followers of Jesus, calling on God to get his sword and arrows ready to deal with his enemies, to call for judgment like that rather than mercy, seems somewhat at odds with the message of grace and forgiveness that we find throughout the New Testament. In the Sermon on the Mount, particularly, Jesus is especially clear about loving our enemies and even blessing those who persecute us. David is clearly not asking for them to be forgiven, but he is seeking justice. He's looking for God to vindicate him and show him to be innocent of the charges made against him. But he's not looking for justice either at some distant point in the future when God will put all things right. There's an urgency in his plea as he calls on God to awake and rise up and judge now. There are basically two kinds of justice in the Bible. Firstly, there's heavenly justice. That is the justice that will be delivered at the end of all things in the final judgment. But there's also temporal justice. That's the justice that is delivered here and now in this life. And it's this latter justice that David is clearly seeking. And I guess the truth is that when we find ourselves in a similar situation, if you've been falsely accused, what you want is to be proven right, like right now. You want to be vindicated. You want justice now. You want that false accuser to be seen to be a false accuser. Not in the final judgment, but now. But we should, notice that David's plea for justice, for God to sharpen his sword and get his arrows ready, can also be read as a warning and a call to his enemy to repent before it's too late. Notice that the sharpening of God's sword for judgment is conditional, for it's only if David's assailant does not relent, that is, abandon his attack on David and withdraw his false accusation. And he goes on in verses 15 to 16 to point out that if judgment falls on this enemy, it will only be because they have brought it upon themselves. By their refusal to repent, they will fall into a pit of their own making. The trouble that they seek to cause David boomerangs back upon them. Today we might say that what goes around comes around. But they've dug a hole of their own making and they will fall into it unless they stop digging. The final words of the psalm are a song of praise motivated by God's righteousness. And, because God is righteous, he judges the guilty and vindicates the innocent. In fact, God is the only one qualified to do so. And it's a marked change from the opening verses of the psalm. But David has called out to God. And as Dale Davis notes, prayer doesn't change us. Prayer doesn't change things, but prayer lays hold of the God who changes things and who in prayer changes us. It's not that his situation has changed, but that David has changed. In bringing his trouble to God and re-engaging in reaffirming that God is his refuge, that he will trust God to be a righteous judge who punishes the guilty and vindicates the innocent, that David can't do anything but praise God for who he is. We don't know if David ever got the vindication that he wanted in regard to these false accusations. but he trusts his life to God. And whatever the outcome, he's trusting God for that. And so he models for us as pilgrims walking in the way of Jesus today. He models for us the proper response to all opposition, and perhaps especially to false accusation, which is so difficult to fight and combat. People believe, as I say, what they want to believe, no matter what you say, no matter what evidence you provide. But God is just. David is affirming that again and again. God is just, and the innocent will be vindicated, and the guilty will be judged. If not in this life, then in the new creation. Until then, we are called to be like Christ, not to retaliate or to strike back, but simply to entrust ourselves to the one who judges justly. And we will find, like David did on so many occasions, that God is our refuge, and he will uphold us through our troubles and be with us in them. God is the pilgrim's refuge. Let us look to him and nowhere else. Thanks for listening.